All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here for another Animal Welfare Foundation lunchtime webinar. And it's my name's Alina. I'm the Grants and Events Officer at the Animal Welfare Foundation. And it's my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today, Dr. Charlotte Byrne. Charlotte is an AWF trustee, so does lots of fantastic work with us. And she's also working at the Royal Veterinary College as assistant professor in animal welfare and behaviour science. So very lucky to have her with us today to speak about animal boredom. And I'll just quickly run through some of the logistics for the session today. You're welcome to pop in any questions in the normal Teams chat channel. We'll also be using Slido for some polls, so just have your phones handy for that. On the screen when they come up, you'll see there's a QR code you can scan, or you can pop in the web address, which will also be displayed, so you can participate in those polls. And then on that platform as well, there's a Q&A section that you'll see where you're welcome to pop any questions in for Charlotte as well, which she can take at the end of the session. So thank you, Charlotte. I'll hand over to you and hope everyone enjoys.
Oh, thank you very much, Alina. And it's lovely to be chatting about one of my favourite subjects today. I just wondered, Alina or Marine, whether it's worth putting the Slido link in the chat in case people want to put that in already, but I don't know if that's possible or not. But, right. So, animal boredom question, kind of, do animals even feel boredom? You know, which animals are capable of it? And how can we even tell scientifically? And does it matter? I mean, for humans, I think boredom is something that many of us kind of love to hate, in the sense that it feels almost like a kind of luxury. You know, in our really busy lives, if we have time to get bored, it means maybe some of the kind of overwhelm has slowed down. And sometimes it's seen as being rather trivial in comparison with some other kind of welfare concerns like pain or fear or something like that. But actually, we know in humans that are incarcerated, it's actually extremely distressing. Some of us had a little taste of that when we were in lockdown during the pandemic, and it kind of sparked a whole plethora of new research in human boredom because it had been so harmful for so many people. And given that animals, most of the animals that we're actually kind of responsible for the welfare of, they are incarcerated, then boredom could be a real risk for them. So I'm going to talk about some of these things in this research. It's not a scientific talk. It's more of a kind of sharing some of the kind of ideas and findings from animal welfare science, just to sort of get people sort of really thinking about animal boredom in terms of animal welfare. Before I launch into the talk, though, I am going to talk a little bit about AWF. I'm really proud to be a trustee of AWF. It's a great charity that really sort of aims to put animal welfare at the heart of all the different veterinary and allied professions, so that we really think about welfare as being obviously just more than just health. It includes the mental health of animals as well. It is the British Veterinary Association's charity. It's very evidence-led, and it funds research into animal welfare across loads of different species. It provides a platform for debates on animal welfare issues. They can often be quite controversial, but it's really important that we talk about them in a really balanced manner. And we support the next generation of animal welfare advocates, be they veterinarians or vet nurses or any of the allied professions, animal behaviorists, animal welfare scientists, all sorts of different people. Whether it feels like that's you, then it is. I know loads of you listening are students, and we have a new student zone on our website. And there's lots of opportunities to actually get involved in research. So we offer grants for students to do a taste of animal welfare research. Obviously, we host these sorts of webinars and also host specific student talks at universities. And we've got a case studies area where you can think about what you would do in awkward cases where you have to trade off different welfare compromises. Whether you're a student or not, you can come to our forum to debate animal welfare issues. The AWF forum is just coming up on the 13th of May, and it looks to be really interesting. So if you want to look it up, if you haven't yet got a ticket, then I think there are still some tickets available, and it looks to be really exciting. You can subscribe to the newsletter to find out about events or the latest news, and follow us on social media as well. So that's AWF, and now back to animal boredom. So first of all, it's useful to know what we're talking about with boredom. There are loads of different definitions, mostly in the human psychology literature, and it can be quite hard to apply some of those definitions to animals because it very much relies on human self-report, so how humans describe themselves as feeling. So we need something that's more kind of objective, I suppose, to be applied to animals. When we're thinking about boredom as a welfare issue, it's important to note that it's an unpleasant emotion. So that's why it's a welfare issue, because welfare is about feelings as well as just physical health. So it's unpleasant, and that means we shouldn't, we have a responsibility to try and make sure animals don't feel bad if we can do something about it. It's not just any unpleasant emotion, it's specifically caused when stimulation is not sufficiently varied or relevant to the animal to be able to maintain the animal's optimal arousal levels. So what that means is kind of optimal wakefulness. So the animal is not tired, it wants to be awake, but the level of stimulation, there's just not enough to actually keep it awake. So it can't go to sleep, and it can't really properly be awake and engaged with stuff. And so it's kind of in this awful limbo, which causes that unpleasant emotion. So I mentioned a little bit before I really got started about why boredom matters for well-being. And when it's long-term and inescapable, it's really far from being trivial or a luxury. In humans, it's reported to cause criminal activity. Lots of people, when they're interviewed about why they did something against the law, they will often say it was because they were bored. It causes excessive gambling, dangerous driving, drug abuse, aggression, depression, really serious issues in humans. So in humans, it's a societal issue and a well-being issue. We don't have the depth of research in animals yet to really know quite how it affects animals, but we do know about the effects of lack of stimulation. So that's not the same as boredom. Boredom is a possible feeling that can arise from this, whereas lack of stimulation is a circumstance that could cause that feeling. We know that lack of stimulation in animals caused abnormal behavior, inactivity, cognitive deficits, so they're unable to learn as well as if they've had lots of stimulation in their lives, and even brain atrophy, so their brains can be physically smaller without, say, environmentally enriched environments, compared with the ones that did have a more stimulating environment. So it seems to have some really important behavioral and even physical effects. So I want to ask whether you feel like animals can experience boredom. So here's the first Slido question. So do you think dogs can feel bored? It's not that necessarily they would all feel bored, but just do they have the capacity to experience boredom? So I'm going to give people a little time. This QR code here can allow you to use your phone to be able to answer this question. And if the QR code doesn't work, then you can see the unique number that brings up this particular Slido session at slido.com. So far, we've got a resounding yes. I'm just going to wait a little bit longer. Okay. So many of us live with dogs and we see them around quite a lot. And they really quite effectively kind of go through almost they mirror our lifestyle to an extent. So we're pretty close to dogs, and we may see them in situations where it looks like they may be bored. And your response is pretty consistent with what we're seeing in questionnaires when dog owners are asked about dog boredom. The overwhelming majority do say yes, that they do think dogs have that capacity. There's a bit more variation, but I'm guessing we're not the most random sample of people on this call, because we're all interested in learning about animal boredom. So the next question is, let's see if I can move it on. Oh, yeah, here we go. So do you think chickens have the capacity to feel boredom? Okay, so a bit more nuanced here and more uncertainty. And that uncertainty can come from a lot of different sources. Partly most of us don't live with chickens, but also they are more evolutionarily distant from us. So they're not mammals, they're birds. And yeah, I think this would probably there would be less certainty about chicken boredom amongst people's perceptions. And probably if we asked the whole population, it would be really interesting to see how many people actually said no, they don't think chickens can experience boredom. Yeah, and I think many people would say that. And the answer is we don't know yet. So there's no right or wrong answer here. Okay, and the next question is about a third species. So here we're on to hermit crabs. So hermit crabs are decapod crustaceans that choose shells to live in that fit them. There are actually loads of different species of hermit crabs. They can be kept as pets. It's a real thing, particularly in the USA, I think. But mostly they are wild, or the ones we would come across might be in aquaria. So yeah, do these have the capacity to experience boredom? So yeah, we're much more divided about this one. Lots of uncertainty here. And perhaps rightly so. They're very distantly related to us. And probably most of us don't have much sort of knowledge about their ecology. So sort of whether boredom would even be part of their kind of ecology or whether it would be useful for them to know whether they've got enough stimulation or not. They can learn, and they, you know, they live in a complex environment. But it would certainly be quite challenging to do science on whether these animals can experience boredom. And but maybe this is coming round the corner, because, as you may know, decapod crustaceans, including hermit crabs, have recently been declared in UK law as being capable of sentience. So that means having feelings. So it may become important to know whether one of their capacities for feelings includes the capacity to experience boredom. Okay, if we have time towards the end, it'd be interesting to explore your reasons for thinking about this, but let's see. I'm going to move on. We'll do some questions at the end, and we can discuss things in more detail there if there's time. Okay. So, do people believe that animals have the capacity to experience boredom more than just what we've been talking about? There have been a few surveys about this, and most animal owners, really, and owners of mammals, have been surveyed more than any others. Most mammalian pet owners, and also farmers believe that animals can experience boredom, but it does depend on the species, as we've seen, and also on the sector of use. So we conducted a study on ferrets, and these are interesting because they're kept and used in lots of different sectors. So this graph shows 5 different respondents from 5 different sectors. So we've got laboratory, carers of laboratory ferrets, working animals, zoo ferrets, rescue ferrets, and pet owners. The dark blue indicates people who said that ferrets can definitely experience boredom, whereas we didn't get very many people saying definitely not, but that would be in the lemon yellow color. So the kind of midpoint of the scale is this kind of pink color. I don't know if people can see my mouse, but there's the kind of magenta color in the middle. And you can see that people who worked in laboratories with ferrets had much greater uncertainty about whether ferrets could experience boredom than pet owners and people working with rescue ferrets. And working animal owners as well had somewhat less certainty. In fact, they were the sector that most commonly said probably not, rather than just rather uncertain, possibly, in the kind of peach color. So this actually matters. People's perceptions of whether animals experience boredom might affect how they actually treat the animals in their care. So we went on to ask about what environmental enrichment the pet owners provided to their ferrets. And we found that pet owners who expressed doubt about whether their ferrets could experience boredom did provide significantly fewer types of environmental enrichment, like toys or hammocks and various things, to their ferrets than people who were more certain that their ferrets would experience boredom. So this is correlational. We don't completely know if it's got a causal link in that sense, but it might follow that if people don't really think that their ferret would get bored, then they might not go that extra mile to provide them with interesting things to explore. Okay, so beyond just our beliefs about whether animals can experience boredom, we need something more than that. So we need some welfare indicators, and specifically ones for trying to identify whether animals experience boredom. So here we're going to come up with a word cloud. So how can you tell if an animal is bored? Because it's a word cloud, it's quite good if you can use one-word answers or very short phrases. And I want you to think about the sort of specific signs that might show that an animal is bored. Yeah, as opposed to maybe other issues the animals might have. And I've chosen these pictures here, not just randomly, but they're pictures where I think there are possibly signs that the animals could be bored. I don't know if they are, but they're showing certain things that would lead me to question whether maybe these animals are being challenged by boredom. So yeah, behavior is really important in this. So we've got various themes coming out as sort of abnormal behavior, repetitive behavior, unwanted behavior, that sort of group of those sorts of behaviors, self-harming, destructive behaviors, restlessness, dullness, lethargy, over-grooming, noise, making lots of noise, being less active than normal, excessive chewing, vocalization again, staying closer to their owner. That's interesting. Yeah. Frustration. Aggression, aggressive behavior. And we've got lethargy coming up as quite strong. So that some of the, yeah, and destruction. Okay. Really great sort of brainstorming those ideas, because I'm then gonna show you how this is sort of these sorts of ideas have fed into the kind of science that is just beginning to be done on animal boredom. So thank you for that, because those span exactly what I was hoping they would span. So you're on, I think, the right track. So I think there are sort of three main hallmarks that can indicate boredom. So if we develop a hypothesis that if animals experience or have the capacity to experience boredom and are experiencing it now, then the more monotonous the situation, the more the animal will sort of show signs that it's seeking increased arousal levels. So those are all those active, restless behaviors. They'll do sort of sensation-seeking behaviors, escape behavior. They'll try and avoid this situation and show unprovoked aggression. But as well as these active behaviors, like you said, they will also paradoxically show signs of suboptimal arousal levels. All that activity is not working. So they're actually still not really able to kind of engage and be as active as they want. So they become drowsy as well. So it kind of alternates between these efforts to avoid sort of drowsiness, but then sort of succumbing towards it. So you see lots of yawning. Yawning when someone's talking to you is kind of considered rude across cultures, just in case it implies that you think the person's boring. Lying awake but staring into space, so eyes open, not sleeping, not properly awake. And we can have some physiological measures as well. So for example, you might be able to see using EEG recordings of brain activity an increase in slow waves, but not going into sleep, just sort of slow, drowsy brain activity. And the third one is rather intriguing and yet to be studied, but we might see animals showing a sense of time dragging across cultures. This is really an important reported part of that feeling of animals, of feeling bored. And in some countries, the word for boredom actually relates to this. So, for example, in German, the word for boredom is Langweil, which means long while. So it seems to be a really important component of that actual feeling. And I'm going to show you in a few slides' time how we might be able to investigate that in animals, but I'm going to pick up on the first two rather important ones that are maybe more accessible, first of all. So with those sort of that kind of paradoxical mixture of the kind of drowsy and the active behaviors, it's really important to notice that any one on its own is not really enough, because each one can be shared with other emotions. So if you think about what yawning can mean, it can be, of course, when we're bored, but also when we're tired, and sometimes a kind of come down from a stressful situation as well. And with restlessness, that can happen when we're bored, but also when we're really super excited about something. So each on its own doesn't really work, but we have to use several indicators together. And if you can try and look for both those kind of drowsiness indicators and the kind of sensation seeking, arousal seeking indicators, then that's rather unique to boredom. There aren't many other emotions that would have yawning and restlessness together. Again, even yawning and restlessness, it doesn't completely eliminate other possibilities, so you might need some more indicators as well. It really matters to distinguish between different emotions. So I think at the outset of animal welfare science, it was really quite, is this good? Are the feelings good or are the feelings bad? Whereas now we're getting a little bit more nuanced in the kind of science and the kinds of questions that we can answer, because actually, even amongst unpleasant emotions, it can be important to distinguish them because the solution to the problem differs. So if you can imagine that an animal is bored, to solve that problem, it needs almost anything different from what it already has, as long as it engages it and gives it something to do. So we might give it puzzle feeders and novel objects, for example. Whereas if the animal is frustrated, that is a kind of an overlapping emotion, but it's a very high arousal emotion, and it's usually when the animal wants to do something very specific or it wants to have something very specific. And just giving it any old random objects will not satisfy that frustration. So I put the example of a burrow here, and that is it comes from research on gerbils that dig repetitively in corners. And one question could be, are they bored? Do they just need some other stimulation? Or is it that just that they love digging? But research has shown that they do that actually when they haven't got a decent dark burrow that has a tunnel leading to it. They're very specific about what kind of burrow they need, and that's what they need. And if you give them that, like if you have deep bedding that can hold a burrow, or if you even give them a plastic one that's the right sort of shape, they stop digging. Also, you could have an exhausted animal that could superficially look as if it's bored, and that one needs rest. So you don't want to be giving it loads of novel objects or thing and puzzle feeders when it's just really tired and actually, yeah, just needs a bit of peace. And sometimes some of these kind of like restlessness and sort of inability to sleep sort of signs could indicate that an animal is in pain, and that has to really be considered carefully, because again, none of these other options will really help it. It needs rest and treatment. So there are loads of ways we can try and pick up apart these sort of arousal seeking and suboptimal arousal signs. I've listed a few that sort of popped into my head straight away, but in animal welfare science, because I am an animal welfare scientist, there are lots of kinds of test setups you can do, like giving animals the choice between monotonous versus more stimulating conditions, and looking at their cognitive bias, which means kind of how optimistic or pessimistic they become in different situations, more stimulating versus less stimulating situations. Obviously, looking at things like escape behavior can be really important. And we've got tests for sensation-seeking behavior and how distracted animals may be. The last ones on the list are polyphagia and polydipsia, which is that there's some evidence that if animals are bored, then they will either eat more than they need or they drink more than they need. So that's what those words mean. And there may be sort of signs that are more physiological, particularly on the arousal side, the low arousal side of things. So unlike other forms of stressors, where hypothalamic pituitary adrenal activity, goodness me, that was a mouthful, but where that actually usually increases. So things like cortisol usually increases with other types of stress. With boredom, because it's quite low arousal, we might hypothesize that it will decrease. I don't know the answer yet because it's such early days with the research. We can be looking at behavior again, looking at that awake inactivity, animals just lying there staring into space, and various other ways that we can try and quantify and compare how animals are responding in more monotonous versus less monotonous situations. So many of you mentioned abnormal repetitive behavior, and I didn't put that on my list. It can be caused by boredom, probably. We know in humans it sometimes is. But actually, research into abnormal repetitive behavior, it shows that usually it has much more specific cause than boredom. So it's usually to do with a very specific frustration. So something the animal is missing, something it really needs. So we actually have to be a little bit careful not to assume when we see an animal doing abnormal repetitive behavior that it's just bored, because then we might do that thing of giving it lots of novel objects and things like that, and it still carries on doing the abnormal behavior when really what it needed was something very specific, and we just need to look a bit more carefully into why it might really be doing these abnormal behaviors. Then measuring time dragging. This in this scenario, it means that we have lots of internal biological clocks that kind of pacemake on different timescales. The biology isn't hugely well understood yet, but our internal biological clock basically is running faster than external time is when time feels like it's dragging. So the external time feels relatively slow compared with what our body is kind of wanting time to do or thinking time should be doing. So measuring this in animals is quite challenging, but in other fields of research, they have developed some really useful time perception paradigms. So one of them is the peak interval task. It's often used in starlings. So here I have my volunteer starling, and it's looking at a red button. And if it pecks this button after a certain time interval has passed, it gets a reward. So it learns quite quickly that if it pecks at after about 11 seconds has passed from maybe a beeping sound or something, if it waits for 11 seconds and then it pecks, it will get the reward. Now, what we expect if we then put the starling in a more boring situation, potentially boring, if it's experiencing boredom, it should start pecking too early, or as if it thinks 11 seconds has already passed, but maybe it was actually only 9 seconds. Now, an alternative is called the temporal bisection task. So here, animals are offered two different keys. So the red key now is the one that they get a reward for if they hear a long tone. So like a beep sort of sound. Whereas if they hear a short tone, beep, then they should peck the green key. So they learn this and they get very good at it. And then you offer them an intermediate sound. And if they're more in a more boring situation, then they should be more likely to interpret that sound as being like the long tone, like it's lasted for a long time. And so it should be more likely to peck the red key than if it's in an exciting situation where the sound sounded like it was only short. This is yet to be done. We've been piloting it, but it's quite, yeah, it's really new, sort of in this particular field. So, as I say, it's very new, but I'm just going to take a little step back and look at the sort of early ideas that signaled that animals might experience boredom. So initially, there was anecdotal evidence. And one of the examples I really love is of a parrot, an African grey parrot called Alex. And he was a language trained parrot, and he could do amazing cognitive tasks. Like he could tell you how many green cubes there were on the table, or if you said what's the color that there are four of, he could tell you that that was the green cubes. But to be able to be sure he really understood the concepts, his owner, Irene Pepperberg, had to do lots of repeats with various permutations of her questions. And during these sessions, towards the end of them, she says that he would, for example, start staring at the ceiling, reply with a color or object label that wasn't even on the tray, repeat it endlessly. This behavior was interspersed with requests to return to his cage, or with requests for water or various foods. So he seems to be trying to do almost anything different from what's currently available, almost as if he's trying to break the monotony. And he didn't, yeah, so he may well have been bored. We also know that animals do show aversion to monotony, so they do try and avoid it if they can, and they will choose novelty and complexity in many different examples. There are some interesting examples of experiments that were not trying to test boredom, and I don't know if the authors are happy with me kind of thinking maybe this could indicate boredom, because they were not looking for that. But there's some really interesting experiments with rats and hamsters that were allowed to choose between two different foods, and then they were given only their favorite for 3 days, and then they were allowed to choose again. And they selected their less favored food after 3 days of only having their favorite. And this was so extreme that it was even when that less favored food was associated with sickness. So, and they did some controls to check that the animals hadn't just forgotten that it made them feel sick, but and they hadn't. So they're actually, it kind of shows how unpleasant, you know, monotony can be for animals, that they would choose something that makes them potentially feel sick over their favorite food when they've had their favorite food for 3 days. Again, it's consistent with boredom, but wasn't an experiment designed to test that, so could be interpreted in other ways. We also know in many different species, mice, parrots, pigs, and rats, they do something known as contra-freeloading. So this is when they choose food that they have to work to access, even when freely available food is available. So if you offer them sunflower seeds with husks on and ones that have already been shelled, they'll sometimes choose the ones with the husks on. So this, yeah, that works sort of consistent with animals feeling bored, but there are other explanations, and we needed research that would actually be more targeted. So Mahar and Mason in 2012 did a really interesting study that was specifically hypothesizing about boredom in fur-farmed mink. So they noticed that those without environmental enrichment spent a lot of time sort of lying awake, inactive. And they had 3 alternative hypotheses. One is, if the mink are bored, then the non-enriched mink should show increased interest in all sorts of stimuli that they could present, even if those stimuli were unpleasant. If the mink are actually apathetic, they would show decreased interest in all stimuli. So apathy is a kind of disengagement with almost anything. And if they are anhedonic, which is another aspect of depression, where people stop being interested in nice things, then the mink would show decreased interest, specifically in the rewarding stimuli. So they offered the mink lots of different stimuli. Some of them were aversive, unpleasant. Some, like an ocean-scented candle, were ambiguous, maybe neutral, and some were positive. So like cats, mink quite enjoy a moving toothbrush to chase, and male mink like female feces, each to their own. And they also recorded the mink's responses to snacks, which are positive, but they decided to analyze those data separately. And they found that without environmental enrichment, so that's the lighter colored bars on this chart, the mink investigated those ambiguous stimuli significantly more than enriched mink. And a similar trend was seen for both the aversive and the rewarding stimuli. Also, like many of us did in lockdown and during revision periods, they also ate more snacks. So this is very much consistent with that hypothesis that that the mink are bored, not anhedonic and not apathetic. They are very much doing that stimulus seeking, arousal seeking behavior. So this might lead us to think that environmental enrichment can reduce signs of boredom, but that's a little oversimplistic because environmental enrichment is hugely varied and it doesn't probably all reduce boredom. So what sorts of enrichments can reduce boredom and how should it be given? So we have a Slido question here, which is when you buy several new enrichments for your animals, you want to treat them and you go into a shop and you buy them lots of new treats. Should you give them one at a time on rotation to keep them novel, or should you put them all in with the animal at once to create complexity and choice? Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So initially there was a lot more, well, I mean, there is a lot more kind of voting towards the novelty being important. I had expected a bit more of a mix, which because we don't really necessarily know, do we? And it's a dilemma because you can't really do both. So, well, you know, you can't do both with all your enrichments. So it is difficult, and it's maybe important to know which one is actually more effective for reducing boredom. Thank you. Okay, so we actually tested novel versus complex combinations of environmental enrichment using lab ferrets as a model. And this was with Alice Dancer, Maria Diaz-Leon, and Jenny Bisley. So we observed these lab ferrets at baseline. Here they are in their nest with some enrichment, but nothing special. Then we looked at them with one of 4 novel enrichments. So they had these for a week each. So one is a paper bag, one is a soft bed, a little box that they can get into, and a like digging substrate. So, and then in the final week, they got all 4 together. So this created a complex treatment, but none of the enrichments were now completely novel anymore. We observed the ferret's behavior on both days 1 when everything was, well, beginning of the week, so everything was novel, and 3 days later, so when they'd basically had the whatever it was in their cage for a few days already. And the researcher was blind to the treatment, so she didn't know whether it was novel or if she didn't know whether it was on day 1 or day 3 that she was looking at. She could sometimes see the enrichment itself. And then we looked at a range of arousal-seeking behaviors and low arousal behaviors. So here are the arousal-seeking ones. You have the day 1 results in the top rows and the day 3 results in the bottom half of the table. And the statistically significant results and the direction of the effect are in purple. So you can see that specifically for room focus, which was basically the ferret looking out of the cage and sort of sniffing and, you know, staring into space, but out of the cage, that significantly decreased, particularly on day 1, but also with 3 of the treatments on day 3, it was reduced from baseline. Also, importantly, scrabbling behavior, which is, it looks like it's probably an escape-related behavior, and it can become quite stereotypic. It was decreased as well by lots of the treatments in both day 1 and still in day 3 with the box and the complex treatment. Turning towards the suboptimal arousal behaviors, again, the most revealing ones were lying awake with the head up, and that was decreased across the whole of the experiment, really, with almost all of the enrichments. And also extra sleep. So we were observing at a time when the ferrets don't normally sleep. And you can see that that's decreased entirely for day 1, and with some of the treatments, including the complex treatment, for day 3, but it's increased on day 3 with the bed and the box. And really, this goes to show not all environmental enrichments do the same job. So actually, these were really comfy to sleep in, and maybe the ferrets actually just were using those enrichments in that particular way because they were nice to sleep in, and they might have been helping the ferrets get extra rest. So novelty was particularly effective. That those day 1 results were very strong in terms of reducing boredom. Complexity, we actually measured some other welfare indicators, such as how much they interacted with the enrichment and how much they played with each other with the enrichment. And complexity was really good for that. So complexity is really important for animal welfare generally, but perhaps these results don't suggest it's particularly good for reducing boredom specifically. So this suggests that with those sort of items that hold lasting interest or do a particular job, like being a comfy bed, those should be provided, lots of them should be provided to create complexity. And then other items that maybe are more less necessary for the animal, they should be rotated to provide novelty and thus help combat boredom. We also previously looked at whether playtime was effective for reducing signs of boredom, not just at the time, but 24 hours later in these ferrets. And we did find that playtime reduced signs of both arousal seeking and suboptimal arousal behavior in the cage, even the day after they'd had the playtime. So in summary, boredom is a welfare issue, especially when it's chronic and inescapable. Many captive animals do live in monotonous situations, and that is a risk for boredom and other harmful effects of understimulation. So we really need to try not to allow animals to be bored if there's something we can do about it. It is starting to be scientifically researched, and that's really important because it stops us trying to have to guess which species might have the capacity for boredom-like states. Some really might not show the signs that these ferrets and other animals have been showing. And, you know, they will have other welfare issues potentially, but maybe we don't need to worry about boredom in every species, and we need to help those species that do experience boredom. And also the science is helping us understand what interventions really are effective for mitigating boredom specifically. Boredom can be recognized when animals in unstimulating conditions show signs of both arousal-seeking behavior and suboptimal arousal. So those are the sort of two almost contradictory signs of boredom in animals. So I have another couple of questions for you, if you want these, or maybe we go to your questions and then we come on to these ones. What do you think, Alina, if you've been monitoring the chats?
Yeah, I think we can do the polls and then
Okay,
come back to questions.
fab. Okay, so we've got 3 of these polls. Interesting. Yeah. And when we do maybe open up to more spontaneous sort of questions or comments, it'd be interesting to know why people have put the answers they have, if there's anything that they want to expand on. Um, I think both the yeses, the unsures, and the nos are interesting here because, you know, the training that many veterinary professionals get doesn't include anything much like about animal boredom necessarily. And so it's interesting when people say yes, because also many of these animals might be quite out of reach in terms of sort of trying to solve boredom in them, depending on what kind of veterinary professional, one is. And the no is interesting too. And I wonder if it's because of the out of reachness of those animals, or whether it's someone else who is responsible for mitigating animal boredom. Um, and the unsure as well. I'm wondering if that's partly because it depends what type of veterinary professional we're talking about. But yeah, lots to unpick. Thank you. Okay. So the next question, how can veterinary professionals help to reduce chronic boredom in animals? And before you look at the options, although maybe you have already, have a think in your own mind about how veterinary professionals of all sorts could reduce chronic boredom. And then you can rank the options, I believe. And if you've thought of something that's not on the list, then it'd be interesting to hear what you are choosing in terms of other. Um, so yeah. Okay. Yeah, interesting. So I would say that the first 2 are the more sort of direct, almost personal effects that one can have. So actually, they're the ones where veterinary professionals are interacting directly with owners. Um, and yeah, you seem to have overall, or on average, rated both the sort of advice about husbandry and and advising about the animal's capacity for mental experience sort of about equally, which is really interesting. And maybe the two do go really hand in hand, a bit like the result I showed you towards the beginning, where if people don't really believe that the animal can experience boredom or other mental experiences, perhaps they won't motivated to provide environmental enrichment and that sort of go that extra mile beyond trying to help the animal just be healthy and survive. And then we've got the sort of less direct effects but that could in a way have a broader reach if there's any effect at all. So I suppose one single donation or one single effort to lobby, maybe signing a petition or creating a petition, maybe there's that risk of it doing nothing. But then if it does do something, it can help loads of animals all at once. So they're all they work on different scales, don't they? And I'd be really interested to know what the other suggestions were as well, because I think we should all be trying to help reduce chronic boredom in animals, and all ideas would be very much appreciated. Shall I do the final question now then? So this is a word cloud again. So a dog owner complains that their dog is destroying their sofa. So what signs would you ask about to help find out if this is due to boredom or some other cause? Again, word clouds work best with very short statements. And I think, yeah, you just press return between each one. You can do more than one suggestion as well. This is really interesting, and I'm trying to pick out themes as I see all these words coming up. Really very, very rich contributions from you all, so thank you. So I'm really interested in the fact that anxiety is the biggest word that comes here when the question was about boredom. Really interesting, and also interesting that almost anxiety might be your go-to explanation of why a dog would destroy a sofa. So yeah, question, and maybe the separation anxiety, I wonder if that explains the word anxiety there, because work on separation related behavior is now referring to it as separation related behavior rather than separation anxiety, because it's in recognition that actually for some dogs it might be anxiety that's fueling that behavior, but actually there could be other causes as well, including potentially boredom. So yeah, very interesting. I'd classify some of these things that you've suggested. So many of them, especially the first ones that came up, were questions you'd ask about what the owner is doing, what the owner is providing, what the routine is. So these would, in animal welfare science, we call these resource-based indicators of welfare. So when you're assessing an animal's welfare, you can look at the animal's situation to figure out its welfare state. Then came the animal-based welfare indicators. So now you're looking at the animal. So you can either look at the resource-based indicators or the animal-based indicators. And they can both be important. So you're trying to find out, is this situation understimulating? And then what is the animal doing? Clearly, it's very important to have picked out some of the health issues that you might need to rule out as causing this problem. So yeah, I think that would be very important to look at. You've also got some mentions of other alternative emotions, so like anxiety, and those are subjective to the animal. So we'd need to look at signs of those emotions rather than necessarily trying to look at the emotion directly, because unfortunately we can't ask the dog. And then yeah, so in terms of the behaviors, there's restlessness, there's responsiveness, social behavior, new behavior. But yeah, interesting that there aren't the signs of boredom that I was talking about. So I had expected maybe some stuff about, is the animal destroying the sofa in between, kind of also lying there staring into space, or being restless, or like scrabbling at the door, showing that kind of escape behavior, trying to pick up its lead or something like that. But yeah, really, really interesting. And yeah, a lot about the animal's situation. So is the owner providing enough exercise, enough environmental enrichment? So yeah, it shows how complex even just one problem can be, and all the different, trying to separate out all the different kind of potential causes. So thank you for sort of brainstorming that so effectively. Right, I can stop sharing my screen perhaps, because that's, I think, oh no, here we go. Further reading. On AWF, we have a kind of little one-page article about what animal welfare is, how we think of it, and then 2 reviews about animal boredom in relation to welfare. And thank you very much for listening. And if you want to know any more, you can email AWF and visit our website. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Charlie. Do you have time to answer maybe one question?
Yeah, and I'm sorry that we've gone over time. I was just so interested in all those polls. Sorry. Yeah, I
No
do have
problem.
time. If others are happy to stay online for just a few more minutes, that would be great. Yeah.
Beautiful. We got a few questions. There was one that came through, which I think would be a good one to finish on, which is climate change targets might mean more intensive farming systems. Is it possible to combat boredom and offer enrichment with small space allowances?
I think that would be very difficult, really challenging. I'm sure it depends on the species concerned, but having something to do in human literature is reported as being a major important component for combating animal boredom, and if you haven't got space to do stuff, then I guess you'd be looking at somehow providing or almost simulating enough stimulation, be it kind of sensory stimulation or something else within a tiny space. Equally, we might have overstimulation if animals are very crowded in and they almost can't find peace. But yeah, I think massive challenge there. Yeah.
Definitely.
Do
Great.
we want to end on that or have another question? Hard to pick.
There's one. This one could be a quick one. Has there been any research on boredom for meat production animals?
I think that's ongoing, actually. I'm not doing that personally at the moment, but I believe there's some research going on in pigs. There was a study by Rebecca Mihar who did the mink study that I mentioned. She looked at dairy cows, not specifically so related to boredom, but she looked at whether they have an interest in novel foods. So she offered them varied foods versus, their favorite. And they were very individual. So some loved their favorite every day, whereas others actually loved it for a little bit and then they started to really want variety. So that's off the top of my head the first sort of probe into that. But yeah, watch this space because I think there's going to be a lot more coming out on that sort of thing.
It's still new.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, that's I think that's a great place to end. Thank you so much. I hope everyone enjoyed, and yeah, keep an eye on the AWF website and social media because we'll keep advertising new webinars as they come in. So thank you again, Charlotte, and hope everyone has a great rest of the day.
Thanks, Alina, and thanks everyone for listening. Thank you.